Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Intersection Science Fellows Symposium first keynote talk. My name is Dr. Rafael Perez, and I'm a first year postdoc at Yale University. And alongside my colleague, Dr. Aya Osman from Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, we will be moderating tonight's session. I would like to remind everyone that there will be a Q&A section at the end of this talk. So if you have any questions for Dr. Dzirasa, you can post them in the chat and my colleague will be asking those questions. And now it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Kafui Dzirasa. Dr. Dzirasa is the K. Ranga Ramakrishna Associate Professor at the Duke University Medical Center. He has appointments in the departments of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, Neurobiology, Biomedical Engineering, and Neurosurgery. He is also the 2019 AAAS Leshner Fellow. Dr. Dzirasa completed his Ph.D., M.D., and residency at Duke, and he has received numerous prestigious awards and distinctions, including the Charles Johnson Leadership Award, the International Mental Health Research Organization Rising Star Award, and the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. He was also recognized as a 40 under 40 in health by the National Minority Quality Forum. Dr. Dzirasa is a member of the American Society for Clinical Investigation. He has served as an associate scientific advisor for the journal Science Translational Medicine and as a member of the Next Generation Research Initiative, the editorial board for TEDMed, and the NIH Director's Guiding Committee for the Brain Initiative. Currently, he serves as the NIH Director's Next Track Advisory Committee and in the Brain Initiative Multi-Council Working Group. Dr. Raza's ultimate goal is to combine his pioneering research, biomedical training, and community experience to improve the outcomes for very diverse communities suffering from neurological and psychiatric illnesses. And I am really excited to hear more about his inspiring journey tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me out there. Like you all, I've been tremendously overwhelmed at what is happening in our country. June 1st, I remember watching the country come together around an issue that has been so weighty for so many of us for so long, around the idea and the theme and the movement around Black Lives Matter. I remember seeing Lafayette Square and people protesting peacefully behind barriers. And then enforcement agents were unleashed on these peaceful protesters. There were chemical agents used, and there was violence utilized against these peaceful protesters. And so, like you, I was alarmed and have been overwhelmed thinking about that moment in our history. And then seeing on the news today, watching protesters and what looked like protesters, ultimately these individuals participating in acts of violence at our US Capitol. And I was particularly struck by this because in the aftermath of those peaceful protests last summer, the president of our United States articulated his clear displeasure with people who were protesting and doing things that involved federal property. And the juxtaposition of those feelings in that moment, of that experience during the summertime, and seeing what was clear destruction of federal property, not just simply federal property or statues, our capital of our United States, it left me without words. And so as I was preparing for my talk today, I realized I just couldn't give the same talk. You know, I've heard over and over again from leaders and scientists that they don't get political. But I think it's important to note that we live in a society, and politics is particularly important for that society. And it is important for us to be able to speak about the broader enterprise and the changes there because they're fundamental to who we are. Later in the afternoon, I saw our president-elect, the rising 46th president of the United States, give a speech as well, in which he condemned the violence. And he made a statement that has stuck with me. And it stuck with me as I was thinking about how to give this talk this evening. And in his statement, he said, "This is not who we are." And at that moment, I had to pause because I thought about that afternoon on June 1st. And I thought about my experiences, the experiences of my friends and those that have come before us. And I was struck in that moment with his words because I thought to myself, no, this is exactly who we are. You know, the United States is a country of great hope, of great love, of great opportunity, and great charity. And it has been since its very beginnings. But it also, since its beginning, has been a nation that has allowed for hate and violence against individuals within its boundaries and across the world. And in as much as I reflect on that, I'm left with this idea that the US is both of those things, and the nature of both of those things constantly challenge each other. And as I thought about how to give this speech this evening and this talk to you all, I realized that I would have to ask you to do something. And I have no right to ask you to do this, but I need to ask anyways. And what I need to ask you all to do is to save this country from itself. I need to ask you all, as trainees, as scientists, and as my colleagues, to save this country from letting the things that have always been there destroy itself. What we saw today was part of what our country has always been, turning on itself. And as you think more broadly about how this looks and how it operates, it would be remiss if I didn't mention the 3,700 deaths from COVID, if I didn't mention watching on TV and thinking about ambulances being diverted in LA and then talking about the limitation of oxygen. In and of itself, as I talk about a country saving it from itself, I reflect on Susan Moore. I think about Jacob Blake and folks not getting charged from that. It's not far from who we are and the science that we do. And we have a broader job in and of itself to save this country from itself. As I sit and I reflect on a nation that's grappling with what it means to compete in a global enterprise, in a nation where its youth and its population looks more and more Black and brown, where women in the history of our nation have experienced violence and haven't given the opportunity to reach their full breadth and contribute to the greatness of this nation. I'm asking you all to save this country from itself. I'm asking you all to take your skills and your talent and your expertise and your innovation and bring it to an enterprise such that the US can thrive, it can be great, it can be transformed, and we can continue to allow this nation to thrive in this world. You know, I've been challenged with this theme, you know, throughout the last 8 months. I've been talking to a colleague of mine, and every time I talk to her, I challenge her that the moment has arrived for all of her training and all of her preparation to transform and save countless numbers of lives. The young lady that I'm speaking about is the keynote speaker for one of these subsequent talks, and Dr. Corbett. And I met Dr. Corbett, and I'll sort of start my talk here. And I think it'll help you to understand why my challenge to you isn't one that I take lightly. I met her years ago. The first time we were on a panel together was in 2017. And she was a relatively young postdoctoral researcher at the National Institutes of Mental Health, working in the virology lab. And we had both traveled to our undergrad university at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and were encouraging high school students to pursue careers in science and think about pursuing their undergraduate training at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And as is customary, like all the scientists, and these are postdocs and graduate students and some junior faculty who have graduated from the program line up at the front of the room, and we talk about our experiences at UMBC and talk about our careers and our trajectories and what we hope to accomplish in the world. And if you ever met a UMBC graduate, one of the things you realize quite early is that we are all filled with strange delusions of grandeur about how we're going to cure something. And at the time, the students line up, the graduates line up, and we all talk about our experiences and pathways in science, and it usually starts from the most junior to the most senior. And in that case, I was the final speaker. I'd had a very strange scientific trajectory, which I'll talk about this evening. I had recently, I was about a couple months out from giving a really cool TED-Med talk and talking about science with the 44th President of the United States and talking about my motivation for pursuing research. And so a lot of the high school students were nervous, a lot of the former Meyerhoff students were sort of nervous, and they found it sort of weird to be standing at the front of the room with me finishing up. And so since that time, it's pretty ironic that now I'm sort of like the introductory act for Dr. Corbett. But at the time, her speech started off, and she was talking about coronaviruses. And she was talking about how important it was to think about coronaviruses and how they posed a major risk to the world, and how human civilization was at great risk because these coronaviruses were going to take over the world, and we weren't prepared to address the scale and the scope of the threat. And I remember thinking to myself, this young lady is a bit of an alarmist, right? Like, certainly, I wouldn't say that, while it was clear that she was a great scientist, it wasn't clear that the threat that she was raising was one that was of preeminent importance, nor that the scale and the scope of investment of our country's research enterprise should be tracking or following the threat that she was talking about. Now, fast forward 4 years from now, clearly everybody in the room was wrong except for her. She is one of the lead scientists of NIH's coronavirus research unit and played a critical and central role in developing the Moderna mRNA vaccines. And I start my talk there because as I talk about this idea of needing to save the country from itself, I think there's a clear example of how starting off with a passion for science and having an appreciation of a problem can, before you know it, history can call on you to meet a moment. And in calling you to meet that moment, what you realize is that there are forces in this country that ultimately have the potential to turn all of the things that have been built into the framework and the history of this country. It runs out of places to turn that rage and that hate on, except for itself. And what I'm calling on you all as young scientists and young trainees to do is prepare yourself to meet that moment. And again, I realize I have no right to do that. Surely each of us can find something better to do, but I'm calling on you to do that. And I'm going to talk about the things that need to happen for you to be prepared for that moment. And if you are here and you're not a trainee, and perhaps you are a trainer or a mentor, I want to spend some time talking about the things that are going to be necessary to support those trainees who will be prepared to prepare them for the moment that they have to meet. So I started graduate school at Duke. I started medical school in 2001 and graduate school in 2003. And at the time, like many a Meyerhoff before me, I was filled with an idea that I was going to totally transform how people who had been injured, people who had lost their legs or arms through accidents, would be able to recover function. And the idea that I was, and I use this word gently, the idea that I was infected with was that I could use engineering tools and principles to create new robotic arms and legs and to help people restore function. And as I started medical school in Duke, I sort of became captured with this idea that the same organ that allowed us to move our arms and legs was the organ that allowed us to think more broadly about challenges in emotional illness, right? Challenges with stress and depression and suicidality and addiction. And I ultimately had the idea that I could use the same sort of tools and technologies that I was thinking about neuroprosthetics, so robotic body parts hooked up to the arm, to arm into the brain directly so that you can move these robotic limbs by thinking, that we can use the same sort of tools and technologies to treat mental illness. We can come up with new, essentially, brain pacemakers to treat devastating illnesses like autism, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, and depression. And I approached an investigator at Duke who was working in this area of neuroprosthetics. And I went and sat down with him and I told him my idea of applying engineering, this field, neuroengineering, and to apply it to come up with new treatments for mental illness. And I'll never forget, he's a world-class scientist, quite famous. I couldn't imagine that or figure out why he would sit down and take time to talk with little old me. But at the end of explaining this idea, which probably sounded just as delusional and out there as Dr. Corbett telling us that coronaviruses were going to take over the world at the time, he looked at me and he said, "Cool, let's go for it." And the reason why that was so important was he was able to look in that moment and see somebody who was passionate and excited, but nowhere near trained, and who had very little idea about how they were going to pull off what they wanted to do. But he was all in and he was all invested. And I encourage all of you all as young trainees, as you enter into the system, there's going to be nothing, and quite possibly before you get to graduate school, you're going to experience an incredible amount of negative reinforcement and voices that tell you that you can't do it and why you shouldn't do it and why it shouldn't work and why it's never worked before. But what is unique about you all, particularly those from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds, is the field hasn't seen anything like you. And your unique gift is the unique set of ideas in your head that have been formed from your experiences. And I encourage you to find mentors that will tell you and respond when you share those ideas, that will respond by saying, let's go for it. And the reason why this is particularly important, so many times as scientific trainers, people think your goal is, to challenge your students and to tell them why things don't work. And that's how one builds a great scientist that's prepared for the world of rejection out there. But in the case of those from diverse backgrounds and diverse experiences, there's more than enough negative reinforcement that you've encountered over and over and over again throughout your life that tells you why things don't work and why you don't belong there. And it's actually the role of the mentor to give so much positive energy and positive vibes and positive reinforcement that the trainee or the mentee can survive the negative reinforcement that will show up in almost immediately. That was the case for me. And so much of my career, if I can give a piece of advice, both for the mentees that I'm challenging to save this country and this world from itself, and the mentors who will guide you through that process, is figure out how to provide positive reinforcement and support, right? It was not long after that first conversation with Miguel that I put in my first NRSA grant for all the non-graduate or postdoc scientists out there. It's basically a grant to the National Institutes of Health, which funds science in this country to the tune of about $40 billion. And you're asking for, a small fraction of that for someone to help support your graduate training for you to pursue a cool set of ideas. And I wrote my grant. I was really excited about it. It's the first cool grant I've ever written. I put it in. And the comments on the grant essentially said what I was proposing was, it said overly ambitious, which in NIH speak essentially means impossible. Now, there are a couple of important points to this grant and putting it in. I put it in. You put it in, you wait about 4 months to hear back. So it's somewhere from like 4 to 6 months, you actually hear back. And during the course and the time it took me to hear back, I'd actually done most of the stuff in the grant, right? So I'd done like 2 of the 3 aims. So the grant comes back and they basically say it's overly ambitious and impossible. And you're at this moment where you're like completely lost, right? Because you think that doing the right thing and doing hard work will always yield rewards. And that is not the case. As your career goes along, you realize that's not the case most of the time when you put in the grant. Sometimes they just don't get it. And so the grant came back. I was extremely discouraged. I was discouraged about my future and my role in science, the likelihood that I would ultimately be able to contribute. And Miguel pulled me aside. And I'm not going to say Miguel was right, but he certainly wasn't wrong in his approach, right? Miguel's answer and his response there was to read through it and say they have no idea what they're talking about whatsoever. They're totally crazy. They have no idea how good you are. Now, in hindsight, having looked back at that grant, there are a lot of things that could have happened for the grant to be improved in terms of its quality and scientific communication. But the most important thing for me to hear at that time when that grant came back was that all of those scientists looking through my grant were absolutely crazy and they had no idea what we were talking about. The need to reinforce my ego strength at that point in time, and for me to hear that there was a space and a role for me in science, that it was okay for me to see things in a different way than anyone else had ever seen them, and that I had a unique contribution to make, was the most critical moment in my scientific development. And throughout my scientific career, I have built and surrounded myself with mentors who look at everything that I do and tell me that the impossible is absolutely possible. And the only reason it hasn't been done before is because the field has never seen me. And I've tried to build this type of thinking into my mentoring approach with everybody I come across, not just the students in my lab, but the folks I come across in most arenas. And I think it is a reasonable hypothesis that the reason problems have not been solved is because the field has never seen you. And so I'm challenging you at this point in time, in my great challenge to change the world in the country. I'm not framing how that should be done, but I'm telling you, it can be done. It can be done because you are here and that you will be entering the enterprise. But I challenge you to find mentors who will constantly reinforce that message. Now, it doesn't mean you don't need to develop skills and that you don't need to grow and that you don't need to become sharpened in your thinking. But there's an incredible amount of negative reinforcement out there from every reviewer, editor, grant reviewer, and person who will come to your poster sessions at talks, where you will get that. You will get opportunities to grow, and your mentor can tell you and help you navigate those critiques that will come. But that was the most critical thing for me. I will say there are other skills that were necessary in graduate school. And oftentimes when you think about graduate training, I think there are things that people forget, right? Graduate training is training, right? It's supposed to prepare you for the world that you're going to enter into. So I want to tell you a couple of things that are important and that were important in my experience for preparing me for what I'm doing now and hopefully playing my role in saving this country from itself. One of the things that I've become increasingly clear on, especially throughout my training, is that there are things built into graduate school that are not optimal for protecting the mental health of those that are training in graduate school. And as a neurobiologist, I always found this particularly disjoint, right? We are pretty sure that your intellect, your creativity, and your insights come out of this organ in your head. As empiricists, we are also pretty clear that this organ needs things to do well and survive and to function, whether it's food or sleep or exercise. And yet we build a system that doesn't reinforce those practices in order to optimize the organ in your head that we're trying to train and prepare to do great things in the world. So in a moment in time where the world is stopped, all right, we have in many cases been asked to stay at home. Over 3,000 people are dying a day, and those people are disproportionately connected to those from underrepresented groups, whether it's 1 out of 800 African Americans that have died in this country. I'm going to encourage you all to pay attention to your mental health, to create space for your mental health, and mentors to create space for the mental health and protect the mental health of your students as well. I thought about my mental health intimately when I was in graduate school. I have families that are family members that are mentally ill. So I always thought about things like building in vacation and rest and exercise. I worked really hard. I worked 14 hours a day when I was a graduate school student, but I also knew how to find myself on beaches in Miami and hanging out with friends and working out 4 or 5 days as necessary. So the first important and critical thing I will say is mentors create space to protect the mental health and mental well-being of your students. There's enough evidence out there to say suggest these are really real problems in our graduate training programs. But then secondly, students make space to take care of yourself and do what's necessary to take care of your mental health. If we consider this pandemic a major trauma, there is clearly a wave of mental health challenges that are likely to follow across our nation. And those from just underrepresented groups are likely to bear that with a disproportionate weight. The second thing that it occurred to me is that, running a research enterprise is a leadership endeavor. And so during my time in graduate school, I spent a substantial amount of time on the national board of the Student National Medical Association. This is an organization of about 5,000 medical students seeking to increase the number of folks from diverse backgrounds going into medicine, participating in community outreach and community health fairs, and thinking about how to do outreach and pipeline development as well. And while, it's unclear if my time and energy there directly yielded something that I would say is a positive, tangible outcome, I will say that the skills that and the training that I got from that experience prepared me to think about how policy works, how you organize groups around vision. And these are things that both showed up in my lab and in what is essentially my side hustle at this point in time as I think about transforming the ideas in my head into federal policy. So as a student, preparing for your moment in the world, make sure to create time and space in your graduate training for your other interests and to develop skills around leadership and communication. They're absolutely critical, and they're absolutely just as central to your ability to transform who we are as a society as the work that you do pipetting or implanting electrodes in an animal's head. All right. And then the third thing, which I think was equally as important, was that I always found time and space to have undergrads on the projects that I was working in. It turns out mentoring is a skill that you need to develop, and nothing should prepare you from starting to develop that skill now. Right. Ultimately, for most of the work that many of us will be doing, it's no longer the science that can be done with one person. Right. It's done by coordinating and working with teams of people, each with different skill sets, in ways that you are ultimately growing the skill sets of others across time. So I'd encourage you to create time and space for mentoring and developing people at every stage in your training. For me, as a graduate student and early postdoc, it was Wesley Phillips, who is now a neurosurgery resident, finishing up neurosurgery residency at UCLA. And there's been a continuous string of mentees since that time, which I've taken the skills that I've learned from my early mentees, sorry, y'all, and optimize those to help the later mentees along their way. And I'm extremely proud of my latest set of mentees, Brittany Katz at UNC, who will be defending her Ph.D. thesis in about a week and a half, Ramo Holtman, who is at Iowa and was recently awarded the NIH New Investigator Award, David Carlson, who's on faculty at Duke, who at 32 was awarded his first R1, and it is an endless string of impressive mentees. For example, Gwen Niall-Thomas, who is a graduate student in my lab at Duke, who was instrumental in helping to build out Black in Neuro and was recently awarded started to put all your business out there, a $10,000 grant from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative for all the work she's been doing around science and communication during the pandemic. So shout out to all of the fantastic mentees out there. There are too many to list in the short amount of time I had. But those skills that are necessary to meet the moment now and to prepare people in the role of saving and transforming the country, I started to develop as a graduate student. And I had a mentor in Miguel who was instructive and informative in helping to develop those skills early on. Now, as you'll notice, I haven't even talked much about the science that I do. I know that's part of why you all asked me here. And I'll simply leave a small point about the science, and I'll try to keep a thread there. I've got about 10 minutes. But the thread there is the very idea that I started with is exactly what I spend the majority of my time doing in my career, but it looks nothing like what I thought it would look like. And the point there is that what I'm trying to convey to you is, doing big and important things takes time. The world changes as you're doing them, and learn the skills that are necessary to participate and lead a transformative enterprise, and you will grow to meet the moment. right? I suspect, or at least I can infer in the way Dr. Corbett was talking about coronaviruses 4 years ago, and I'm sort of giving an introduction to her talk. It's unclear if she thought 2020 would be the exact moment, and the solution to that would be figuring out how to create vaccines and bring them to market in 10 months, and that's ultimately how her career would evolve. So I want to focus more on the skills that are necessary to meet the moment. This idea of finding mentors, whenever I give career talks, I always say it's not just about finding a mentor, it's actually about, and I mean this gently, take it with a grain of salt and in jest. I always say stalk a mentor, right? Your goal is to make mentoring as easy as possible by aligning as many factors as possible such that people don't even realize that they're mentoring you because they don't have to go out of their way to do it. Now, I don't mean break into their house and sit in on their dining room table waiting for them to mentor you, but I'm not suggesting you get too far away from that, right? As a graduate student, my advisor had two labs at Duke and a lab in another country, and he was simultaneously building an entire research enterprise in his native country of Brazil. And whenever I wanted to talk about research, we could always email, but when he was in town, like he had 1,000 priorities. And I had no expectation that I should be number one on the priority list, right? I was doing something that was totally out there that wasn't the thing his lab was funded to do. And there were times where I found myself sitting outside of his office for 6 to 8 hours waiting for a 15-minute meeting. And sometimes at the end of that 8 hours, he'd leave at the end of the day and I wouldn't get my meeting, but he'd always try to make time the next day because I think he could not believe that someone would sit out at his office for 6 to 8 hours. And, but I always say, look, if I want to go into finance and, I would fly to the opposite side of the world for a 15-minute meeting with Warren Buffett, right? And I think as students, you have to think about mentoring the same way, right? If you want to have a transformative impact in the world, do what you have to do to convince people that it's easy to mentor you and that they should be investing the little amount of time they have in you. I have gone as far, and I've never actually admitted this in a public forum because it's sort of funny. I've gone as far as to figure out which flight a prominent speaker was on, book myself on the same flight, make sure that we randomly ran into each other in the terminal as we were getting off of the flight. And then I managed to get a really fantastic 45-minute mentoring session in a car ride over to the conference that I knew we were going to together, that I registered at because I knew the person was going to be there, right? And I say that to point out that person has played a fundamental role in how my career has developed. And ultimately, that person will still to this day tell you that their time investment in me has been one of the most important mentoring investments that they had made throughout the course of their career. So I'll fast forward to the end and talk about one project that I'm doing now. As a bit of background, I am an engineer by training. I stick electrodes into the brains of mice. I record electrical activity in their brains, and then I try to understand how electrical patterns in their brain are linked to mental illness signatures, right? In the same way a cardiologist reads electrical activity in the heart to try to understand your heart patterns, I try to do that in the brain, and it's what my career has largely been based on. All of my funding has largely been around doing just this. After finishing medical school and graduate school in 2009, I started my own research lab, and one of these mentors that I've mentioned looked at me and said, you're a little bit different. You're a little bit outside the box. At this point in time, I would play, the introduction to one of my favorite 2 Chainz songs, I'm Different. And they said, look, like, you're a little bit different. The system wasn't really created with a whole lot of people in it. So it probably hasn't been optimized for you. So how would we build a system that would work for you? And after a long conversation, we concluded that the best way for me to get training and for me to continue to develop my research career was for me to start a research lab and then do training in residency and psychiatry part-time. Now, this sort of thing isn't actually done. So I was simultaneously on faculty in the Department of Psychiatry at Duke and did residency, and I did residency part-time over the course of 6 years instead of 4 while I was building my research lab. And the idea there was just for me to continue to do research, and then at the end of that, be like the perfect applicant for K99R00. Well, this all went sideways in a really awesome way. Lots of stuff went wrong. Most of it went wrong. I have a high tolerance for failure, but halfway in, I'd gotten my first R1, right? And so the reason why I point this out is not to say that like I think there's anything super like unique about me. I think I am different, but I have mentors that figure out how to take the stuff that's different about me and actually make it useful. Right. So, and those same lessons around of having Miguel there when my first grant got trashed. Mind you, I've gotten more grants trashed than grants that have been funded. I failed more tests, whether they're for stages of my medical board licensing or other things. I failed more tests than I possibly should at every point in my career. And yet most people would look at my career now and pick up my CV and decide that I'm ultra successful. And the mentors have always been the ones that force me to push the boundaries, push every amount of my talent out, and tolerate an incredible amount of failure so that I can get those small wins, those small successes that ultimately end up being transformative. All right, so I'll finish the last 2 or 3 minutes telling you how I found myself meeting the moment. Now, I told you my goal was to identify brain signatures and patterns that are diagnostic of mental illness. I have not succeeded in doing that. I'm a psychiatrist by training. I haven't cured any major mental illness. Throughout my participation in multiple organizations, I've constantly thought about training the next generation workforce, about equity, about healthcare. And in February of this year, I found myself at Hopkins prepared to give a talk. And I was going around and meeting the speakers, as we often do, and I ended up in an investigator's lab, Dr. Daniel Weinberger. And we were talking about genetics, which I will sort of graciously acknowledge that I almost failed my first year of medical school. I'm an engineer by training. I never really figured out the whole genetics thing in the entire course of any part of my training. Genetics was almost as bad as biochemistry, though I had a eureka moment like 4 years after biochemistry when I realized that kinases add phosphate groups to proteins. It was quite remarkable, would have been helpful in my biochemistry class. But I'm sitting there in Dan Weinberger's office, and he's explaining to me that I've built this entire enterprise where I'm trying to find patterns for mental illness in genetic mouse models of mental illness. And he's pointing out that the gene data sets that are used to find risk genes for mental illness are primarily based on people of European ancestry. And as we're talking and we're getting into this, he's being even clearer about this concept where these risk genes may not actually extrapolate against populations. And so here I am, I'm sitting there building this entire enterprise to help people with mental illness, and it might not even help or work for people of my ancestry, right? My parents both grew up in Ghana and West Africa. I'm clearly not of European ancestry. And I was myself likely working on an enterprise, developing therapies that may not extrapolate more broadly to the population. And it struck me there that this was the moment that my entire career had prepared me for. A moment that included training in psychiatry to understand the impact of mental illness, a moment that understood basic science research, a moment over the next few months that we would see George Floyd and his neck under the knee of an officer, a moment where society would all of a sudden realize the importance of training a new generation of scientists that took advantage of all of the talent population of this country as COVID was exploding and devastating communities of color. And it needed someone who was prepared to speak about the intersection of all of these things. And in no way, shape, or form could I have imagined that in 2020, that all of the vision and ideas that my mentors had throughout the course of my training that they invested in would have prepared me to meet this moment. And this moment that was so critically important for saving this country from itself. So I began there with this challenge to you all. This is not a challenge that I haven't taken upon myself as well. I'm happy to speak more broadly about the things I've done across different enterprises to both prepare and try to make some headway in meeting these challenges. But I want to communicate to you all that as we all sit around in an incredible amount of pain, that pain it was put there as part of the activation energy for you to take your skills, your talent, and all of your preparation to transform the world that we live in. So thank you all for having me here. Obviously, I'm happy to get more into the science to whatever extent you all think is necessary. And I'm happy to take questions as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dzirasa, and good evening, everyone. As Raphael mentioned, my name is Aya Osman, and I'm a third-year postdoc at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and I will now be moderating this evening's Q&A session. We've had a few questions come in, but as time is limited, it's likely we won't get through all of them. If there are any more questions coming in, please do try and keep them succinct so we can get through them. And so without further ado, if you don't mind, Dr. Dzirasa will get started. And the first question, which is from an anonymous sender, is actually a two-part question. As someone who's from an underrepresented population in neuroscience research, I often find myself separating my identity as a scientist and as a Black person. Do you have any advice on how to integrate such identities? And the second part is also, do you think it's possible to integrate issues such as racism, mass incarceration, and trauma into basic circuit neuroscience?
So the answer is yes. So I'll start with the second one. Excuse me. I'll actually answer both questions at the same time, right? So who you are is your strength, right? Scientist is an enterprise of communication and information observation, synthesis, and transference between brains, and those brains existing within humans, right? So everything you are and everything you have been throughout your lifetime that starts with a genetic framework and then includes environmental experiences shape how you perceive, interpret, and communicate information. There is no way whatsoever to separate who you are as an individual from your function in the world, let alone in science, and you shouldn't try to do it either, right? Like in fact, I've always argued that a unique set of strengths, if your goal in the world is to discover something or to observe something or communicate something that no one else has ever done in the history of the world, which is what you have to do to get a PhD, your unique strength is that you have a set of experiences that allows you to see information in a different way, right? There is always new information in a place that no one has looked before. And I would encourage you to start to experience all of those things that make you different. And trust me, I don't want to minimize the burden that comes along with being different. It is a real burden, which is why you need the mentors in the first place. But that is your unique scientific strength, and you should never lose it. For me, as a circuit neuroscientist, I ended with that project around, and it's called the African Ancestry Neuroscience Research Initiative, because I actually think that that initiative will inform everything that I do, right? It is indeed the case that there are risk genes for mental illness that show up in an ancestry that do not pose the same degree of risk on another ancestry, which means that if we think about ancestries or genetic background as the history of human migration, it means that like nature in humans has solved problems multiple times over on different ancestries across time. And so while we think about, the need to find risk genes and develop circuit therapeutics, circuit neuroscience approaches, which understand how risk genes break circuits, how breaking circuits changes behavior, it could be the case that what we need to be studying is resilience that shows up in one ancestry that isn't there in another. That begins with first expanding our enterprise around biomedical research to better study and understand folks of different ancestry. Doing this requires scientists that are mindful of the way science has been used for mistreatment in the past, so that they can begin to bridge that.
Thank you. That was really informative. I've actually I'm doing a lecture series on this topic starting on the 19th of January, where I'm trying to kind of create a discussion around what kind of streams of research we need to be doing to kind of look into the mental health impacts of racism, migration, colonization causing us to move, slavery and what it's done in terms of like ancestral trauma. So that was really, the project you said is called the African Ancestry Neuroscience Initiative.
Neuroscience Research Initiative, yes.
Okay, perfect, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, so in terms of like integrating the two identities, I do realize that's something a lot of younger people who enter the field kind of look to us older people in the field, and they wonder, you know, I've had that question a couple of times, like, how do you fit yourself in, like with, you know, your Black side and your culture and everything that you do kind of away from work, and then you come into work and you kind of have to have this slightly different persona. And I think a lot of younger people get disheartened when they see some of us older people kind of having two personalities in a way. And so I think, yeah, it fills them with a lot of confidence if they hear that it is possible to integrate the two.
Yeah, let me just say, listen, I can't be nobody but me, right? Like I just want to be frank about this, right? And in me being who I am and my skills and my unique contributions to science come out of that, right? Like I create a lab and a space and an enterprise where people can do that as well. My goal is not to, I don't know how to fix the world and get rid of all of the problems for those that are a step behind me, but they sure better have an easier time, right? Because I have been there. But my expectation in that is a deposit that I'm putting, and I expect a return on that deposit investment. And part of the return on investment I expect from that is that they are also mentoring and making something easy for somebody else, right? So look, I mean, I sort of don't joke around. I'm more likely to be in a hoodie than in a suit, but I was also in a hoodie most of the time in graduate school, right? Like I touch mice, right? Nobody wants to go home smelling like mice in a suit. It makes sense, right? Like I remember walking into research buildings, going to conferences all the time where people have Metallica shirts on. And I'm like, look, I don't understand what the difference is between a Metallica shirt and a Biggie shirt, right? Like they're both in the Hall of Fame, Rock Hall of Fame, right? So we just have to, our job is to figure out how to be ourselves, and as mentors to create space for people to be themselves. And I would encourage everybody on this call, as long as you're old enough to read, you're old enough to be a mentor for somebody else. And so create space for other people. But you got to do you. Right? Like, listen, I know how to code switch, but I don't code switch as much as I should, probably. I sort of like, I've decided I just got to be me.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for sharing that. That resonates with many of us. We've had several more questions come in. I'm going to try and combine two of them. So just bear with me while I try to do that. So someone's asking, I think it's Hannah V, as someone who's still finishing my undergrad degree and hope to pursue an MD, PhD like you someday, how do I channel my frustration and passion amongst going through a system or structure that feels catered towards a selective group of people? So I guess, yeah, managing that kind of frustration, how do we do it? And how can I make science more accessible? And then the second question kind of touches on that, you know, you touched on the importance of mentors. To what extent do you think you can be also inspired by your trainees?
Oh yeah, like my trainees are awesome, right? Like shout out to all the millennials out there. If you've seen like any of my videos, they're all done by millennials, right? I'll start off with one because she has in many ways been one of the most inspiring individuals that I've trained. And I pick her not because she's brilliant, she is, but because of her fortitude and tenacity and you know, I don't give a, you know, whatever, that causes her to push through boundaries. And this is Gwen, Gwen Altoma, who's in my lab. And it was Gwen who, after the murder of George Floyd, I was going back forth with her and I was talking, and she asked me to read a letter that she'd written expressing how frustrated she was, how the experience of watching and how all the outrage around watching, you know, a foot on the back of the police officer and the injustice of that, how much of that was present in the buildings she walked into, in the departments, in the meetings, in the conferences, all of that was in there in the scientific enterprise, right? So while everyone was all up in arms, this was the same way people were treating her every day, and it was built in the history of our institution. And so as I read her letter, you know, I start by doing the mentor thing, which is giving her feedback and grammatical, suggestions. And it occurred to me after the second round that it was not going to have the impact or the weight that it should in promoting transformation. And so I sat there, I pulled out a glass of wine, and I started crafting the first op-ed that I wrote. And I realized that there could be backlash from the approach that she was taking. And it was my responsibility to take on that backlash. If people were going to punch at somebody, they needed to hit me first. And it was her tenacity that challenged me to basically put down on a sheet of paper all of the things that I thought were awesome about my career and juxtapose that with all of the pain and the weight and the hurt of my experience in becoming who I am and the things that remain the challenges around the daily experience of being who I am. So to each of you out there, right, I don't want to give you the impression that saving this country from itself is an easy, fun job, right? It's why it's a challenge, right? It's a charge, it's a calling that I'm putting in front of you all. I think it's incredibly rewarding. I think you can make an impact. I think the work that you all do would, for example, save millions of people from being impacted from the next devastating pandemic, or would transform people who have been impacted by racial trauma, right? And we would figure out how to come up with therapeutic agents to protect an entire group of people in this country from those devastating impacts, right? The work that you have to do is important and it's weighty. And that's why I challenge you all to take that pain and to funnel it and to meet it with a unique set of skills that you have, right? The majority of Americans don't graduate college, let alone end up in graduate school. You are there. It means you have a unique set of skills and gifts. There are those throughout the history of America, many throughout the history of America, who had those unique set of gifts and skills and did not find themselves in the enterprise that we have been able to enter at this point in time. And so it's why I charge you to bring those to form. Now, the system ain't optimized for you. I just want to say it, and I want to be clear, right? Like, every system optimizes itself over time. It is not optimized for you, right? The system is not optimized. We've seen it this year. It is not optimized for women who have small children at home. It isn't. Like, we know, like, it is not. The pandemic has revealed how terrible and how awful science is for those who are simultaneously raising small children. It has not been optimized in that case, right? So there will be challenges out there, but I don't want you to give up in those faces of those challenges. I want you to push back against it. This is why the mentors are so important. Find mentors who have voice and who have power and who are willing to take on the cause that you are so passionate about. They exist, right? The vast majority of my mentors, some have been African-American men and some have been quite important, but the majority have not been, right? The majority haven't, the majority have not been African-American men. Not all of them have been men, right? But in the confluence of that, they are all bought into the things that I care deeply about. They're all bought into minimizing the pain that I experience in the field because they know it's shared by a broader audience. And they're all bought into the vision of what I can be. In fact, the vision of what I've become is greater than the vision that I thought it would be. Although some of them will say, this is exactly what we thought you would become because they forced it and shaped it. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. And I hope whoever asked the questions is satisfied with that. I think, yeah, you're 100% right. We need to be resilient and we need to realize we are resilient and that's how we got here, and just keep that with us and keep us going. I'm going to give you one final question and I think we can just go until 10 past. There's somebody who's asking about they notice that people in positions of power in academia have held that those who have mental illnesses or who have friends who have experienced mental illnesses do not belong in research and in graduate school. I know this is falsehood, but how do we go about kind of navigating that conversation if it comes up? And I'm just going to combine that with another question that came in, which is, what advice do you have for us future academics in dealing with structural racism?
Yeah, so let me take that in two parts. There's an incredible amount of stigma behind mental illness. Some of this stigma is associated with the fact that we do not yet have the biological substrates of mental illness, and medicine has had a really complicated history in that we stigmatize things that we don't have the biological substrates of, particularly before we have extremely effective treatments. This doesn't mean there aren't treatments for mental illness, so I want you all to take advantage of them, but I mean extremely precise targeted treatments. This was the case with HIV/AIDS. It was a case at some point in time with, the plague, and it may very well be the case with COVID as well, thinking about that, right? So there is stigma around mental illness, and there's a long history of medicine to stigmatizing areas in which we don't understand the biological substrate. Secondly, there's some stigma around mental illness because, what we fundamentally are is a social species, and what mental illness uniquely does is disrupt our ability to be social with each other, right? To synchronize our brains within one another in the framework of what we would call emotions. So there's stigma there. However, I think as scientists, we should be really clear about this. Like, mental illness is broad, right? It's broad, it's pervasive. I would not be surprised if many of those mentors and advisors who have stigmatized mental illness as a result of, staying in their home and experiencing and participating in engaging in social isolation for 8 months won't have remnants of mental illness themselves, right? Mental illness isn't just anxiety and depression, it's alcoholism and drug abuse, things that are extremely pervasive, not only at the level of trainees, but the level of the trainers as well. And that stigma allows us to create a framework that says, if there is something about you that presents a challenge, it is wrong. And that it's a framework that's reinforced as if those same traits are not there amongst those leading the enterprise. I can promise you they are. There's anxiety, there's social dysfunction, there's, and enterprise can be extrapolated more broadly beyond just the academic enterprise to thinking about some of the folks who lead our the great enterprise that is our country, right? There's pervasive challenges about what one would think should be normal emotional function and how that shows up at multiple levels of leadership, right? So I want to encourage you that there's treatment out there for mental illness. It is pervasive. It is normal. It is human. And that does not translate into a lasting dysfunction or an ability to participate in an enterprise, right? I'll sort of quote one of my favorite artists here because I was really struck by this statement, and I thought it was a pretty cool statement. It was Kanye, and he was being interviewed by Letterman. And Letterman asked him about his mental health, and he said, y'all love this crazy music. I'm gonna paraphrase. He said, y'all love this crazy music, you love these crazy shoes, you love this crazy fashion, you love the crazy art. Like, at some point in time, it's worth considering whether that comes from someone who's crazy, right? and I think his point there was that sometimes we love the product of being different and thinking about outside the box and the creativity that comes out of it, but we're unwilling to tolerate that innovation and that outside the box thinking coming from everybody else. So I sort of use that comment in jest because I thought it was pretty funny when Kanye said it, right? But I really think it sort of buttresses the argument that I've tried to make today, right? Which is, it is okay to be different, right? And it is okay to not entirely be understood all the time by a structure that hasn't been optimized for you. But mental health, like being a diverse graduate student, can be successfully navigated with the appropriate amount of support and persistence. So I want to sort of end there on that encouraging note, right? The country needs you. It's pretty clear, right? The U.S. will not survive, and it will not survive nor thrive as a scientific enterprise, as a biomedical institution without your participation, your ideas, and your brilliance. The path will be hard. There will be more days that feel terrible like today than days where we celebrate popping bottles, but we need you. we need you to do it. And we're counting on all of you all. And anything that I can do to enter into your space and to help you along your way and your path to doing great things, I am available to you. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Dzirasa. Honestly, the comments coming in are just like, great talk. We needed this today. A few people saying that you should write a book and it will become a bestseller. So
I wrote a book. I took a
Oh, right.
vacation. I wrote a book. It's literally been sitting on my desk for like a year and a half now because I did not intend to publish the book when I wrote it. It was just a fun thing to do. So there we go.
Okay, so it's coming. There we go. Thank you very much for sharing that with us.
I did not say it's coming. It's sitting on my desk. We'll see what happens with it.
All right. Well, we'll watch this space and see. Thank you very much for your time tonight. And thank you for such a great keynote. I just want to thank everyone else for participating. You can all use the same link again tomorrow. We'll start at 10 a.m. sharp with the amazing Kazmika Corbett giving her keynote. And so we'll see you all then. Thank you very much again.
Thanks all.
Bye.